Please stand for the singing of the Australian National Anthem.
Australians all let us rejoice, for we are young and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil, our home is good by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts, our beauty rich and rare. In history's page, let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains, then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
Please be seated.
Dr. Lam, your microphone is muted.
Chag Atzmaut Sameach. I'm delighted to join you all today. You know, just very recently, we celebrated Chag HaMatzot. We celebrated Pesach. And it's at that time with Yetziat Mitzrayim, with the Exodus, that the people of Israel were first identified as Am Yisrael. And 50 days later, they celebrated at Har Sinai when they received Torat Yisrael. It took 40 years and they came to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel. And so the first state of Israel was established. This is a particularly important time right now. Today we celebrate 72 years from the establishment of the state in 1948. And one of the founding groups that was very involved was the religious Zionist movement, the Mizrahi organization, the parent of Liebler Yavne College. And the motto, the ethic of the ethos of Mizrahi is Eretz Yisrael, La'am Yisrael, Al Pi Torat Yisrael, combining Eretz Yisrael, the state of Israel, and the people of Israel with the Torah of Israel. So as we commemorate Chag HaAtzmaut, Yom HaAtzmaut, we recall our connection with Israel. I'm delighted that today our two speakers will be two gentlemen that I've worked very closely with during their terms as ambassadors. Ambassador Dave Sharma, when he was in Israel, I was the president of the Zionist Federation, and Ambassador Mark Sofer, Israel's ambassador to Australia. And they were exemplars of leadership and representation of their countries. It's great that they're both on today. We will enjoy a fantastic session. Wishing you all Chag Atzmaut Sameach.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to share a brief Dvar Torah together with you before we hear from the ambassadors, or present and former ambassador. Although I think Dr. Lam's words already qualify as a Dvar Torah, I will add a brief thought of my own. We currently find ourselves in the build-up to Shavuot, the anniversary of when we received the Torah. And prior to receiving the Torah, God charged us with a mission. And he told us, "Va'atem tiyu li mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh." You should be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Similarly, in our reading this week from the Torah, prior to receiving some of the major tenets of our faith, we are told, "Kedoshim tihiyu," you should be holy. What we see is that when God educates us, he first charges us with a sense of mission. He gives us a purpose. He tells us to lead elevated spiritual lives. He tells us that we are all Kohanim, meaning we should all be leaders. We should all be representatives. We should all be ambassadors. And that's what we try to do at Yavne. Our hope is that all of our students would be wonderful ambassadors for their faith, for our school, for their people, for Australia and for Israel. And I'd like to thank the two ambassadors for joining us today, not only for being ambassadors in your current and former official roles, but also in your personal example. It is our hope that our students will be able to emulate you with your sense of mission and your sense of purpose as well, to be great ambassadors for Australia and great ambassadors for Israel as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lam and Rabbi Mervis. The program for the session that we are running now is that first we're going to have a small presentation, one from Ambassador Mark Sofer, and then the second will be from Dave Sharma, MP. Following each of those presentations, there's going to be an opportunity for questions and answers, where using the Q&A bar on the side of your screen, you'll be able to put forward a question. You can already start putting them in if you already have them now. We will be selecting some of these questions for both Dave and Mark to address. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Mark Sofer. Now, just a little bit about him. Mark Sofer has had an extensive career as an ambassador, from his time in Ireland to India and now here in Australia. He has a reputation as a man who is of wonderful oratory skills and a tremendous representative of the country of Israel. He's British born, he has 3 children, and we are very excited to have Mark have you with us here. So here you go. Mark, your microphone is on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Rabbi. Thank you for the Rav Melvis. Thank you, Danny. Just a few words, if I might, plus some thoughts about Yom Ha'atzmaut from our point of view. And truth is that, of course, this year everything is different from in the past. I wrote recently in an article that Yom Ha'atzmaut is always celebrated outside. It's always in the open air. It's events and manga and barbecues and dancing and singing. And of course, this year we're all at home. And I do believe honestly that this is the time that we should use this year for a little bit of reflection. Reflection on 72 years of the State of Israel, and 72 years in which, frankly, if we look back on those years from the time of 1948 until today, I'm not a rabbi, I'm not a person who thinks in terms of miracles. Maybe we shouldn't talk in those terms in the present day, but nonetheless, clearly, I think we can be proud of what is, I think, probably some sort of small or minor miracle of the State of Israel since its inception in its modern form in 1948. Let's not forget that it rose from the, reeling from the ashes of the Holocaust. And since then, in 1948 until today, not one day of peace, not one day of accommodation with the entire neighborhood that we are in. In fact, through the ages, through the 72 years, what we have seen is war and terrorism, rejectionism, denial. Bottom line of all of this being, of course, that even today, we are living in probably the world's lousiest neighborhood, of that there's no doubt, with the Hamas and the Hezbollah and the Syrians and above all the Iranians. It's really quite a lousy neighborhood. And I wish we had Australia as a neighbor. I wish we had countries of that nature, but we don't. And so I think the question is, despite all of the awfulness in where we exist and the difficulty, the security complex, the surrounding hate that we've had to face for 72 years, how is it that in that period of time, the whole country and the society has transformed itself from literally a basic agricultural society of people coming from around the world in the 40s and the 50s to what is today a powerhouse, there's no other word, leader in world innovation, leader in technology, leader in basically everything that the world needs. We are now in Tikkun Olam, helping the developing world to develop itself. More 20%, 25% of the cyber security in the entire international world community is Israeli. Already we've had a spacecraft encircling the moon. every part of instigation, water technologies, medical technologies, everything that we do is really at the forefront of the world. How is it possible that with all this hatred, all these security problems, with all this difficulties with which we started, we've managed to make ourselves into where we are? And of course, we mustn't forget perhaps the most important thing of all, and that is since 1948 until today, the integration of literally millions, maybe 4, maybe 5 million Olim from around the world, 1 million from Russia, 1 million from or from the Middle East or from around the world. All of this going on at the same time, and yet we are where we are at the forefront. Now, it's very easy to say, my goodness, well done, pat ourselves on the back and go home, that's fine. But I think that the reason is much more than that. I think also as Jewish people, and I wrote this as well, we've had experience of hardship, we've had experience of difficulty throughout the ages and throughout the centuries. And we've always pulled through, and we've pulled through better and stronger than we have before. And I think that this has been part of the national ethos, part of the national being, and it's manifested itself in Israel today. Of that, there's no doubt whatsoever. And it's this national resilience, this national experience that we've had throughout the millennia and the centuries that has brought us where we are today, and what has helped us to get through these trials and tribulations that we go through almost on a daily basis in Israel itself. I do, however, think that, or perhaps before I say that, maybe a word. Not everything is perfect in Israel, and I think it would be wrong for us to say so. I think it's not the right thing to do, is to make everything perfect and hunky-dory when there are problems. We're a very split society. We're grappling with a lot of issues that other parts of the world all grapple with. And I think that we should be very careful to look also at the difficulties that we face in order that we can overcome them, and not to gloss over them and say that they don't exist. It's very important indeed that we know what they are and that we tackle them. We need to have peace with our neighbors. We need to get over some of the internal societal problems that we have. But at least if we don't recognize that we have them, then we won't be able to tackle the difficulties as we move ahead. However, nonetheless, we are where we are right now. And I think not only is it the resilience that's brought us to where we are, literally at the forefront of the international community, but I've lived around the world. Literally, this is my 7th diplomatic mission, mainly in Asia, but also I've lived in Europe and in South America and the United States, mainly really around the world. And what I've seen is that despite all the extremism directed against us and hatred directed against us, there is an enormous amount of friendship. The friendship is coming from the Jewish communities. The friendship is coming from outside of the Jewish communities, in not just in the Christian communities, but in people that believe that we are doing the right thing. Okay, even if there's criticism, it's deep friendship. And I think that that's crucial and a part of what we need. I look at the relations The relations today with Australia are really at one of the highest ebbs they have ever been. They've always been good, and I think we should be cognizant of that fact. We've never had a bad relationship with Australia. Yes, there are difficulties and differences of opinion, but nonetheless, I think that today we can be really thankful and happy that we have that relationship. It's part and parcel to do with the Australian leadership. We have here Dave Sharma, you're right, whoever said, and I remember him on the other side of the coin as head of the Asia division, one of the best, if not the best foreign ambassador we had in Israel. I'm not talking about Australian ambassador, I'm talking about foreign ambassadors that we had at the time, and a deep and close friend of Israel. And I hope to call him, and I do call him, a close friend of mine, because we have known each other for some time now, Dave, and really he's an exemplary of the close and deep friendship that we have outside of the Jewish community towards Israel in Australian society. And here is something that I want to say really to the youngsters and to the students who are watching this. One of the reasons that Australia and Israel, one of the reasons why the world, we have such a lot of friendship, and we are so, despite the tribulations, despite the difficulties, and despite so much of the hatred against us, we have so many friends, is because of the Jewish communities around the world and the friends that we have within the Jewish communities. And I think that being here now for over 2.5 years, I cannot praise enough the Jewish community of Australia, and I say that without any compunction whatsoever. It's one of the closest, one of the most Zionist, one of the most supportive communities, if not the most close, if not the closest, and the most supportive in the world. And I think that when we look ahead to the youngsters here, and I say, how can we cement even further this relationship with Australia? To a large extent, we need you, And I dare myself to say to the fact that you need us as well. I think that the Jewish community of the world, including Australia, needs a strong and a vibrant and a cohesive and a forward-looking Israel, in the same way as we need the support of the Jewish communities around the world, including the youngsters of the Yavne College and others. Now, you youngsters will be the future leaders. My future is behind me. Your future is in front of you, and I can tell you that we need you. If I can leave you with just one thought, please don't become indifferent. Please think of Israel as you move forward into your future. Please be active. Please be at the forefront of fighting for the cause of the State of Israel, for peace, for coexistence, for resilience, because together we will make ourselves a better state. We will make the Jewish people a better nation. And it's only through you and us working closely together that we will achieve that. By ourselves, we will achieve something, but it won't be nearly as much as we can achieve together. You know, I read somewhere, and with this I'll finish with just a final thought, that 72 in the Gematria is Chesed. And Chesed, as we know, is kindness, is opening, is hospitality, is opening up your hearts, is opening up your minds, opening up your soul. Maybe this year when we're at home, celebrating Yom Ha'atzmaut, we should think of Chesed, we should think of working together, we should think of kindness within our societies, and look forward to working closely, not only with the Jewish community of Australia, but with you, the youngsters of the Yavne College, as you move into leadership roles in just a few years to come. So thank you very much indeed to all of you, and Chag Ha'atzmaut Sameach, and I'll be staying online. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Mark, for those words, and also for that Dvar Torah as well. Chesed and 72, it's a beautiful connection there. We are going to be having Q&A shortly, and I've already got a few questions coming through. I'm just going to ask that anyone in the audience who wishes to pose a question puts the name, either Mark or Dave, before their question, or writes both if it's going to be referring to both Mark and Dave. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dave Sharma. Just a few words about Dave. Many of you will know that Dave was previously the Ambassador of Australia to Israel. What you may not be aware of is that Dave's diplomatic career actually began in 1999, and he's been in Papua New Guinea and also Washington, DC. Dave currently holds the seat of Wentworth in Eastern Sydney, where he was voted in this past May. So it's a wonderful honour to have Dave with us and for Dave to share with us a few words. Dave, just a reminder to unmute your microphone.
Thank you so much, Chaim, and thank you for having me here today. Thank you, and hello to all the students there at Yavne. And let me acknowledge my friend and erstwhile colleague and colleague still, Mark Sofer, and Danny Lamb as well, who's another good friend of mine from many years ago, and Rabbi Mervis too. Thank you for the Dvar Torah. Yom Ha'atzmaut has lots of fond memories for me. When I was in Israel as the ambassador, it would normally consist of the eve of Yom Ha'atzmaut, a barbecue, a fair, a play in the local park, children running wild, a lot of fun and a lot of happiness. And then the day itself, all the ambassadors would go to the president's residence, the Beit HaNasi in Jerusalem, and Mark would be there, and Yuval Rotem would be there, who many of you would know, and others from the foreign ministry, and we'd all drink a toast and to Yom Ha'atzmaut Sameach, and make our best wishes known for Israel. And obviously this year it's a little different. It's a little different here in Australia. We're not able to celebrate as we normally might, and it's also quite different in Israel. I've been following what's going on there. I think they had a virtual reception at the president's house, I saw, for the diplomatic corps, and a virtual toast and things like that, which is unfortunate, but I'm confident that we are both tough and strong and resilient nations, Australia and Israel, and by this time next year, we will be by and large back to normal, and we will be able to have these sorts of occasions again. I did want to reflect a little on my time in Israel and some of the lessons I took with me from there, and still carry with me today as a member of Parliament. And I think the first is really just what a remarkable set of achievements Israel has made in its 72 years of existence. From, let's be honest, some rather inauspicious beginnings, not very hopeful beginnings. When Israel was created as a state, it was surrounded by hostility. It was not wealthy. It was not prosperous. Many people thought it might not last very long as a state, and if it did, it wouldn't achieve the sorts of heights that it has. But in what is really, in historical terms, the blink of an eye, Israel has gone from a nation fighting for its very survival with a relatively basic economy and facing security threats all around it, to 72 years later, a country that is prosperous, that is secure, that now gives aid to a large number of other nations rather than being in need of aid itself. And is, although it lives in a very dangerous neighbourhood still, is in probably its most secure strategic circumstances in which it ever has been in 72 years. And I always found my time in Israel to be a fascinating study in just what it had achieved, and for me, how it had achieved this, how it had all of this come about. And I think there are some important lessons for Australia that I still take with me, and I think are important that we all learn from. And the first of those, I think, is the creation of the State of Israel. The success of the State of Israel has been a tremendous testament to Israeli statecraft. That's its diplomatic service, that's its military service, that's all the arms of the state. To be created in a hostile and adverse environment, to survive against the wishes and the thoughts of many of its neighbours and adversaries, it's been a testament to very clever, very adroit, very nimble, very flexible Israeli statecraft. And whilst we are blessed here in Australia to have a lot more natural strategic advantages, we have a continent to ourselves, we live on an island, we've got a big distances of ocean separating us from our neighbours. I think nonetheless, our neighbourhood is becoming a little tougher, and our neighbourhood is becoming a little more contested. And I think we are learning, and there's much more for us to learn from Israel and from how it goes about defending and protecting its interests in a region that is much less benign than here in Australia, but for Australia, which is also becoming less benign. A big part of that, of course, is Israel's innovation, its technological edge, its willingness to try new things, to disrupt things, to embrace new ideas and new thinking. And that's a secret to Israel's success, not only in terms of its survival and prosperity as a state, but its economy as well. Large parts of Israel's wealth and prosperity and jobs these days, of course, come from its technology sector. And this is where it really leads the world in cyber, in agri-tech, in water use and management, in artificial intelligence, in big data, and any number of these big verticals that we talk about that are changing the way the world works and changing the nature of business and commerce. Israel is a leader. And again, I think this is an area where we in Australia have tried to learn as much as we can from Israel. What is the secret to Israel's success? What are the parts of Israeli policies that we can replicate? How do we encourage more entrepreneurial and innovative business culture? How do we encourage more young people to go into these to pursue their ideas and find a way to commercialise them and turn them into business ventures? I think this is an area where we're doing more and more together as nations, and I think it's really very much the future of the relationship. And the last thing I touch on, where I think Israel is a fascinating study and of relevance to Australia, is how to build a new nation from many constituent parts. And Mark touched on this in his remarks, but just like Australia, Israel is really a remarkable migrant success story. There were the early Zionists, the people who settled Israel in the day of the Yishuv. There was the Mizrahi wave of migration that came in the 50s and 60s when Jews were expelled from Arab countries throughout the neighbourhood. There was the big wave of Soviet or Russian Jews, former Soviet Union Jews in the 90s and 2000s. And then today there's Olim coming from France, from Ukraine, from Australia, from the United States and Ethiopia, and how Israel integrates all of these people and finds a way for them to find their own identity within the State of Israel in a way that's consistent with Israel's national identity, but also respectful of their own traditions and identity and culture and customs. I think it's a great study in what we call multiculturalism here in Australia. And I think this is an area where Australia can be proud, and we've done a great deal, but I think there's a lot we can learn from the Israeli experience as well. Just to finish up, I think as Australians, we should be incredibly proud of the role we played as a friend and a supporter of Israel all through this journey. From 103 years ago in the Battle of Beersheba, when we fought over the territory that would become the future state of Israel and defeated the Ottoman Empire and created the map that would allow the Balfour Declaration to be implemented, to a role in 1948 and helping shepherd Israel's acceptance into the international community through the General Assembly and the organs of the United Nations, and even up until today. And I think that's reflected in the warmth that exists between our leaders, the warmth that exists between our political classes, and the warmth that exists between our peoples. And then to conclude, I would say that for the students at Yavne and all of you, never underestimate the important role that Australia can play in standing by Israel's side. Yes, we're a long way from the Middle East, and yes, we're not necessarily the first country that Israel turns to when it's facing difficult times, but the moral support, the legitimacy, the assistance that we can offer Israel, I think should never be underestimated. And it always touched me when I was the ambassador and Israel was facing tough times, whether it was being ganged up on in Geneva or in the UN, or whether it faced an awful wave of terrorist attacks. The fact that Australia was prepared to stand up and to speak out and to condemn what was wrong and to praise what was right and to defend Israel's reputation was something that I think was always greatly appreciated in Israel. So you all have a role to play. You're all leaders within your community. You're the future of the community here in Australia. And please take your stewardship of this relationship seriously, because it depends upon all of us doing our part to keep this relationship strong and healthy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dave. And I'm going to keep you on the screen because our first question I'm going to pose to you, it's equally relevant to Mark, but we'll start with you. And I'm just letting the audience know that we've already got quite a few questions coming through. We won't be able to answer all of them, but please do make your question clear who it's addressing. So this one is for both, and that is, what is the biggest challenge that you came across in your role as the ambassador? So we'll start with you, Dave.
The biggest challenge. Look, I'll be very honest, because I'm not a diplomat anymore, so I don't need to be overly diplomatic. The biggest challenge for me, honestly, was managing Australian domestic politics in the context of the relationship. So I worked for, during my time as ambassador to Israel, and I kid you not, I worked for 4 different Australian prime ministers. I worked for Julia Gillard, I worked for Kevin Rudd, I worked for Tony Abbott, and I worked for Malcolm Turnbull. They were all prime ministers during my time. I only ever had one Israeli prime minister I had to work with, and he remains the prime minister to this day, as of a few days ago, Benjamin Netanyahu, but 4 Australian prime ministers. And look, to be honest with you, there is some politics in Australia within this relationship. I don't like that that's the case. I'd like there to be less. But there are parts within the Australian body politic that are less supportive of the relationship with Israel that would like us to distance ourselves from Israel. I think they're a minority part. They're only a small part of what's going on in the relationship. But for me as an ambassador, making sure that I think I supported government policy and faithfully articulated government policy often meant that I was a huge focal point for criticism in Australia of the people that dislike Israel for all sorts of reasons, from straight anti-Semitism to a perverse and distorted view of history. But it was quite a political role to be thrown into for someone who's used to having, as a public servant and a career diplomat, not necessarily having that sort of profile and attracting that sort of criticism. For Mark and Israeli ambassadors, I think it's par for the course. They have a hard time wherever they go, because Australia are used to sort of being someone that people find likeable regardless.
Okay, I'm going to pass on to Mark now. So Mark, if you can tell us the biggest challenge in your career as ambassador.
In my career, that's lucky you took me outside of Australia, because my career spanned more. Because had you been speaking only of Australia, I would have found myself, I'm sad that I spoke after Dave, because I would have said exactly the same answer as him. The biggest problem I had since my time here is domestic politics. We've had a year and a half basically in transition and caretaker government mode, and that hasn't made life very easy here for us. But I think on a more serious note, if I look back over the I hate to say this, but almost 40 years in the diplomatic service, just under 39. I think probably the hardest personal time I had was when I was ambassador in India at the time of the Mumbai attack, which the older ones of you will remember, others might have read about it, and the attack especially on the Chabad on the community house in Mumbai when I was ambassador there, and the horrors that was really being stuck right in the middle of a terrorist incident, of which, of course, we were the targets as well. Having said that, and I can talk for hours about that, maybe one day I'll write a book or an article about that awful period because it was traumatic, and even though it was 13 years ago now, I still remember it vividly as if it were yesterday. It caused quite a scar right in the middle of a terrorist incident. But I think if we revert back to here in Australia, I think Dave is right to a very large extent. We really have to make every effort that this relationship is predicated on bipartisan relationship as much as we can. Yes, of course, there are detractors and those who will do us less good or ill. Having said that, I do think that they are in a minority. We make a fuss about them, we deal with them, we talk to them or try to, but in general, I think public opinion here is very favorable towards Israel and towards the Jewish people, actually, as is right in a multicultural world.
Yes, well, because we have quite a few questions and not a huge amount of time, I'm going to ask the following questions. If you can try and limit your answer to 30 seconds or less, and I know that's not going to be fair, particularly with the question I'm about to ask you right now, which is from Tamar Dayan. Do you think peace in the Middle East is achievable in our lifetime? So, Mark, 30 seconds or less.
Well, I read somewhere the religious school. I read somewhere that God once said that He's not sure it'll happen in His lifetime. I don't know whether that's a doable thing. I'm not a politician. I won't be one. But the fact of the matter is that I do believe that the willpower is there. The political issues are so wide, so difficult. But I think that there's a change in the Middle East. I think we're going through an architectural strategic change between Israel and the Arab world, and in the Middle East, if I've learned one thing, is never to say it's not going to happen. And I'm a firm optimist, and I do believe that we will get there. There will be a lot of trials and tribulations, but we'll get there. That was probably 33 seconds.
Okay, Dave.
Sorry, just unmuting. Look, thank you, Tamar, for the questions. One I thought a lot about. Look, I'm hopeful, but I wouldn't put money on it. I mean, some of the problems that bedevil the Middle East, and I'm talking here the broader Middle East, not Israel's relations with it. They're quite entrenched, and they're generational or more to resolve. And I think if I had to sort of characterise one thing that I think hurts the prospects for peace more than anything, it's a sort of a zero-sum political mindset that tends to exist in the Middle East, and which is quite unusual to us as Australians. It's the idea that if someone is doing better off, you are thus doing worse off, and so you want to deny anyone any gains, even if it costs you something. And I think Israel has always approached the region with a positive sum mindset, which is we can both win from working together and coexisting alongside one another, whereas much of the Middle East is still views a win for some other side as a loss for themselves, and that makes progress very difficult.
So while we have you with us, Dave, I'm going to pose the next question first to you, which is, what lesson can Australia and Israel learn from each other with regards to the approaches taken to combat COVID-19?
Look, I think there will be a lot of lessons that Australia and Israel learn from each other, but also that we learn from the rest of the world. I think it's almost too early to say what those are yet. We've obviously had some successes here in Australia, so has Israel. I think that Israel's got some unique challenges with parts of its community in terms of limiting social distancing and isolation, and it's got a much more densely populated country, which makes it harder. But I think Israel's technological approach, we've certainly learned from some of the apps and the sort of the data tracking in the public marketing communication messages we've been following quite closely here in Australia, but I expect it's something we'll have a lot more to discuss in a few months' time when the worst of this is behind us.
Thanks. Mark, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I will say just one thing. I think it is too early. I think Dave's right. But having said that, both Australia and Israel are at the forefront of finding the vaccine and the cure to the COVID-19. And I think what we need to, first of all, just about 3 days ago, there was a telephone conversation with about 7 international leaders throughout the world, which included the Prime Minister of Australia, the Prime Minister of Israel, and about 4 or 5 others of the countries which have made the most advances, New Zealand, Austria, etc. And the bottom line of all of that is that we have to cooperate more. I think when this is behind us a little bit, what is most important for me, as long as I'm here as ambassador here in Australia, is to try and bring about a closer relationship between the academic and scientific institutions of Australia and the scientific institutions and academic institutions of Israel. We have a lot that we're doing a lot together. Let's not say that we're not. We're doing a lot together, but there's much, much more that could be done. And I think with the level of genius that there is here, and if I can be very honest and say the level of genius that we have in Israel as well, we can do so much more together, including and perhaps especially in tackling possible pandemics of this nature in the future. We've learned a lesson here. There's things to be done, and like-minded states have to do that. And that's where I think I'll apply myself for to a large extent in the future.
Mark, I'm going to keep you here for the next question. And that is, every Yavna student is a mini ambassador for Israel and Australia.
Wonderful.
What can they be doing better to represent Israel?
Well, first of all, I'm glad that I don't look at them as mini ambassadors, but as maxi ambassadors. I think that it's me that's the mini ambassador. I think what needs to be done, first of all, is to spend this time in school learning. This is the time to educate. This is the time to look to the future. In just a few years, especially the older ones of the youngsters will soon be at the university, where they will encounter enormous, or not enormous, you will encounter hostility, they will encounter problems, they will encounter people who will do us ill. They have to be ready with the facts at their fingertips. They have to learn and be at the forefront of doing it. I said earlier in my presentation, the worst thing, and Elie Wiesel has taught us this many years ago, the worst thing is indifference. Never be indifferent. Always take a stand. I don't even mind if the stand is critical, but take a stand. And when you go to university, when you move forward, when you go into life outside of school, which is your learning experience, be at the forefront of helping Israel on the information front, on the Hasbara front. Learn the facts. We'd be happy to help you with anything that we can. We look at you for help rather than you for us. You will be our true ambassadors in just a few years to come. It's not a job, it's a calling, it's a vocation, and that's how we see you.
Thank you very much, Mark. We'll end with one question for Dave. And let me just bring Dave online. Dave, the question for you is, besides for the food, what do you miss most about Israel?
I do miss the food. It's funny how often my wife and I and children talk about the food that we miss. Look, I think if I had to sum it up, it's the energy and the vitality of the country. And, most of your audience today, I'm sure, has spent time in Israel, and you know that there's a pulse to life and an energy to life, which is sort of embracing in all its vicissitudes, the high points, the joys, and also, the low points and the tragedies. But you always get the sense that people live life to the fullest in Israel. And I think, in Australia, I think sometimes our temperament is a little more even, and that has its blessings. Of course, life is a bit more predictable and a bit more orderly here and a bit more structured, but you miss out on some of the fun and the joy. I would just say as well that we're getting our Israeli fix at the moment, my wife and I, by watching Fauda. The new season of Fauda is just out, so we're watching our episode every evening.
Thank you so much, Dave. I'm going to pass us on now to our principal, Ms. Sherilyn Skews, who will conclude this event.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's my privilege to thank both Ambassador Mark Sofer and MP Dave Sharma for joining us here at Yavna in Melbourne today. We really appreciate your time. I felt that supposed half an hour, it felt like about 5 minutes. It would have been lovely to have been able to sit and chat a little longer. So I'm sorry that I'm already bringing it to a close. I thank all of our students and families who've also been part of this and posting their questions. I'm sure Rabbi Cowan's going to share all of the questions that weren't answered in this brief time, but it'll be lovely looking back over those too at some point in time. So as a principal of a Jewish school in Melbourne, there were 2 points that really resonated with me. And the first one, in fact, Ambassador Sofer repeated at the end of what he had to say, and that was, please don't become indifferent. I wrote down here, fight for Israel, fight for peace, coexistence, and do so with kindness. And I thought that was such a important point to make. And then the other point I wanted to say was never underestimate the important role Australia can play standing alongside Israel. It is important and appreciated. And as Dave said, Israel might not always reach towards Australia first, but we should never underestimate the power of standing alongside Israel, because I'm sure that they know we're right there by them. So again, thank you to both of you, and thank you to Rabbi Cowan, Dr. Lamb and Rabbi Mervis, and to all of our participants this afternoon. And that actually brings the formal celebrations of Yavna, of Yom Ha'atzmaut, to an end, and we will now conclude with Hatikva.
Please stand for Hatikva.
Please be seated.